story of the nose, as retold from the Brothers Grimm. So there were 3 soldiers, as friendly to each other as brothers, close with love and friendship. These 3 soldiers were the kindest and nicest, the most honourable men you could ever hope to meet. They had one fault, 2 rather. It was that they had no cunning and no courage. So although they would treat all things and all people with fairness and courtesy, they had no drive to kill, no drive or urge to fight. They were completely useless, in fact, as soldiers. So they were let go from the army and cast out into the world. Now these 3 soldiers found themselves deep in the dark forest, as people do in this sort of story, and they sat around their fire. And as they grew sleepy, 2 of the soldiers rolled up in their sleeping bags to sleep, leaving the first soldier on watch, as they always did every night, as they had in the army. And when the first soldier sat there by the fire, as his brothers slept, he heard a voice call from the darkness saying, "Who is it? Who's there?" He replied, "It's I, an old soldier here with my comrades, warming myself by the fire. Come and join us, sit, rest a while." And out from the shadows stepped a little old man as gnarled as an old oak tree, with a bright red coat. And he said, "Well, I thank you for your hospitality, I will." And he sat and he warmed himself by the fire, and he talked to the soldier, and he heard all about how the soldier's life had been, and he learnt of the soldier's kindness and his love for his friends, and he learnt of the lack of cunning and the lack of courage that had led these 3 soldiers to be sleeping in the forest. So eventually the little old man stood up and said, "Well, I must be going, but thank you so much for the warmth on your fire and that kindness. And in reward for that, for the kindness that you've told me about your life, I'll give you this gift." And he handed to the soldier a cloak, a magic cloak of wishing. Whoever put this cloak on could wish for whatever they wanted, and it would arrive. The soldier thanked him, curled himself up in his own sleeping bag, bid him goodbye, and went to sleep, first calling for his brother, the second soldier, to wake up and take watch. Now the second soldier sat by the fire on watch, and he too heard a voice from the darkness saying, "Who's there?" And he too called out that he was a soldier, sat with his brothers, and he too invited whoever it was to come and join him by the fireside, and he too met the old man, gnarled as an old oak tree with the red coat. And he too also told his story to the old man, and he too received a gift for the kindness of allowing the old man to sit by the fire, for the kindness he had shown throughout his life. This time the old man gave him a bag of gold, and no matter how many pieces of gold were taken out of it, it would always refill itself. The second soldier thanked him kindly, bid goodbye to the old man, and settled down to sleep, calling for the third soldier to wake up and do his time on watch. And as happens in these stories, when 2 things have happened, 3 things always happen. So, like the first 2 times, the soldier sat there and he heard the voice from the darkness, and like the first 2 times he answered and invited whoever it was to come and join him. And again he saw an old man as gnarled as an old oak come by the fireside with his long red coat, and he sat and they talked together as it had happened before. And the gift he received from the little old man was a horn of summoning, a horn that if he blew on it he could summon a fairy host to do his bidding. Now the little old man left, and the 2 other soldiers awoke with the coming of day, and all 3 told their stories together and agreed that they should share these treasures amongst them. And so they travelled far into the forest until they found themselves a clearing. The first brother put upon his cloak and he wished for a magnificent castle for them to live in. The second brother took his bag of gold and went to the nearest town, and at the market he bought them livestock and horses, he bought them furnishings, fine clothes, he bought them plenty of food for the larders. And the third brother, he blew on his horn and he summoned a fairy host to come and live with them, to play music with them, to cook beautiful meals for them, to tend to the horses and the livestock, and to live with them in the castle, making them the finest, happiest and richest men in all the land. Now soon word of this reached a queen on the other side of the forest, a beautiful queen, a magical queen. And this queen heard of this amazing castle that had appeared, and these three amazing beings who seemed to summon all this magic and all this wealth around them. So she invited them to visit her in her castle. So the three soldiers set out with their fairy hosts and all their rich trappings and their horses and their carriages. And they processed through the forest until they reached the Queen's castle, where the Queen entertained them to the most sumptuous of banquets, the most amazing of parties and concerts, all the entertainments, all the luxuries you could imagine the Queen lavished upon them. And throughout this time she listened to their stories, and she learnt of their kindness, she learnt of their lack of cunning and their lack of courage. And being full of courage and possessing not a little cunning herself, she learnt of all of their treasures that they had received. She learnt of the source of all of their wealth and all of their magic. And so she decided that she would like these gifts for herself. So during the banquet, talking to the second soldier who had his bag of gold with him there, she asked if she might see it, and taking it and using a sleight of hand and her cunning, which we have mentioned she had a great supply, she swapped it for a bag filled with stones. That second soldier, having no cunning himself, didn't notice this at all, being distracted by the revelry. And soon after that, the Queen bid them farewell, and the three soldiers returned to their castle, only to discover that the bag of gold had been replaced. Now they knew immediately who must have done this. They knew the Queen must have swapped the bag at the banquet. And so they decided to scrape together the tiniest bit of courage they could find, the tiniest bit of cunning they could find. And with this tiny bit of courage and this tiny bit of cunning, the first soldier put on his magic cloak of protection and set off through the forest to get back the treasure. Now he came to the castle and his knees knocked together, and he held on to that tiny spark of courage he had, and that tiny spark of cunning, and he wished for the guards to not see him as he entered the castle, and he wished for the courtiers to not see him as he walked through the halls, and he wished to find the bag of gold that had been stolen from him. And up he went, up a spiral staircase, up to the very top of the tower, and in a chamber where the Queen slept, beside her bed on a table, there was the magic bag of gold. And as the soldier reached out to pick it up, two pieces of gold clinked together. The Queen immediately awoke, and having courage herself, she shouted out, "Guards! Guards!" Now the guards came thundering through the door, 20 men armed to the teeth. The poor soldier, with his last scrap of courage, completely deserted him, and in the panic his last bit of cunning completely deserted him. In fact, all of his sense and all of his wits deserted him, as can happen when someone is in a panic. He did the first thing he could think of, and he leapt from the window. But as he leapt, the Queen jumped from her bed, grabbed hold of the cloak and pulled it off his shoulders. So the poor soldier fell, tumbling down through trees and through bushes and through thorns, and thumped into the ground at last. More hurt in his pride than in his body, even though he had his fair share of bumps and scratches and bruises, and he limped back through the forest, a sorry figure, back to his brothers. And he sat there with his two soldiers, his friends, and he told them of everything that had happened, how he had not only not got the gold back, but he'd lost the cloak. Now the third soldier leapt up and decided he must act. He blew on his horn and summoned forth a fairy army, a host larger than any he'd seen in all the land, and they rode together, the three soldiers and the fairy army, back through the forest, back to the Queen's castle. Now, as I've said before, the Queen had plenty of courage and not a little cunning. She knew what would be coming. So she ordered the drawbridge pulled up, the portcullis lowered, all of the soldiers to line the castle walls, so that when the fairy host arrived with the three soldiers, they found the entire place secured against them. So they lay siege around the castle, declaring no one could come in or leave until the gold and the cloak were returned to them. Now the Queen looked out and spied the army and realised it must be a fairy host summoned from the magical horn, the horn she had heard the soldiers talk about. One thing she knew about fairies was that they love music. And another thing she knew about fairies is that they loved to dance. So she came down from the castle that night, and she danced amongst the fairies, and she sang a beautiful magic song she had learnt long ago. And all of the fairy army were enticed and enthralled by her. They all danced and sang and clapped and dropped their weapons. She danced around them. And as she did so, she saw the three soldiers leave their tent and come and see, and they too were entranced and enchanted. And as they were so distracted at her prearranged plan, her loyal maidservant snuck into their tent and stole the horn. She came and handed it back to the queen, who immediately blew once into the horn, dispelling the fairy host, leaving the 3 soldiers alone and confused. She blew again as she summoned the hounds of the Anu, the fairy hounds from the underworld, to rise up and to chase the soldiers away. The 3 poor soldiers ran back into the forest. Their magic castle now dissolved due to the queen having the cloak, their riches gone due to the queen having the bag of gold, and their fairy host gone due to the queen having the horn. So they were left with nothing. They sat around the fire in the forest again, in the same place they had been before, bemoaning their fate. And like before, they heard a voice calling out, "Who is there? Who is it?" And like before, they answered. They were 3 soldiers sat around a fire. And stepping into the firelight came once again the little old man, gnarled as an old oak tree, wearing his long red coat. The little old man asked them, "Why is it you are back here in the forest? Why are you not in your castle? Why are you not there with your host and your riches?" They told him their long, sorry story, all about how they had lost what they had been given, how they had no courage and no cunning, and they didn't know what to do. Now, the little old man looked and he thought, and he said, "Well, those gifts I gave you, should have seen you fine for the rest of your life. They were gifts given to you because you deserved them for being so kind all of your life, for being such good men. I don't like to see the gifts that I gave you in the hands of another. However, it's due to your own lack of any courage and any cunning that you lost them. So were I to give you more gifts, you would only lose them again, surely, due to your lack of courage and your lack of cunning. If I were to help you this time to retrieve what is yours, could you find your cunning and could you find your courage?" To this the 3 soldiers said, yes, of course they would find the courage and they would find the cunning they would need to get their treasure back, if only the little man could help them. So the little old man, was gnarled as an old oak tree, wearing his long red coat, led them deeper into the forest to where 2 magical trees grew, the most beautiful trees you could ever imagine. One was an apple tree and one was a pear tree, and they glowed with such life and vitality that you could almost not even look at them. Now, the little old man said, "Here we have an apple tree and here we have the pear tree. Now, the apple, the fruit from the apple tree, can cause a great malady and a great problem. And the pear from the pear tree can repair that problem and return things to normal. These I give to you. All the fruit from the apple tree and all the fruit from the pear tree are yours to use. However, I can do no more. I cannot tell you how to use them. You must figure that out yourself, and you must find your own courage and your own cunning to be able to use them. That's all I can do for you." With that, he left. Now the 3 soldiers sat there all night, and together they scraped the very, very, very pits of their hearts and the very, very bottoms of their stomachs, the very, very recesses of their minds, and they found the last scraps of courage and the last scraps of cunning they could find. And they teased them out almost as tiny threads, and these tiny threads of courage and these tiny threads of cunning, they began to strand and weave together. And as they wove more and more and more and more, they grew together larger and larger amount of cunning and a larger and larger amount of courage. And they sat there all night, all 3 together, and they grew and they grew and they grew that courage and that cunning, and they nurtured it and they sang to it and they talked to it and they believed in it and they chanted to it and they did everything they could possibly find in their hearts to grow the courage and the cunning that they had found between them. And between the 3 of them, they were able to empower and grow enough courage and just enough cunning for a plan to regain their treasure from the queen. So the next day the first soldier approached the queen's castle, this time in disguise, with a hood pulled over his face and a basket full of the golden apples. And he had his share of the courage and the cunning they scraped together, and even though his knees were knocking together, and even though he was worrying and stumbling over his words, he summoned all of it as he approached the guards and showed them the apples he had to sell. Now the guards looked at these apples, and they were the most beautiful apples anyone has ever seen in all of the world. And as they reached out to try and grab them, the soldier said, no, these apples are not for you. These apples are only fit for the queen, the most beautiful queen in all the world. You must let me in so that I can give her these apples. And he said it with such confidence, using all of his courage and all of his cunning. he passed by the guards and walked into the castle, into the halls. And there the courtiers came forward, licking their lips and rubbing their hands together in joy at these apples that they were soon to have. And once again the soldiers summoned that courage and that cunning and said, no, no, I cannot give you these apples are only fit for a queen and no one else. And so he was admitted. He went up the spiral staircase to the highest chamber in the highest tower, and there before the queen he said, oh, my beautiful queen, most beautiful in all the land, these apples are yours, only you deserve them in reward for your beauty. And with that he stepped back, bowed to the queen and left the castle, using the little bit of his courage and cunning that was left to walk calmly down the spiral staircase and out of the castle, calmly back into the forest. And as soon as he was out of view, he broke into a run, rejoined his brothers the soldiers and said, phew, I've done it. He sat down and had a little shake. Now the queen, she gorged herself on these apples as anyone would, presented with the most beautiful apples in all the world. She ate and 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 she ate. Soon she began to feel strange, not strange in her stomach, like you would if you'd eaten something bad, or strange in her throat, like you would if you had something caught there, but strange in her nose. And as she felt her nose, she felt stranger and stranger still, until to her horror she felt her nose begin to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow longer and longer and longer. And the nose seemed to grow from her face and grow until it grew all the way across the room, until it grew towards the door. She shouted out quickly to her maidservant, quick, open the door, open the door. The maidservant sprang up and opened the door, and her nose grew out through the door. Her nose grew out across the hall, her nose grew out to the staircase and began to grow down and down and down the spiralling staircase, out across the halls of the castle, out through the gates, past the shocked guards, and down towards the moat, where it finally stopped growing with the very tip of her nose in the moat, sending a chill all the way back up the nose, through the gates, up through the castle, up the stairs, back through the door, and back to the queen. Now the queen was in absolute dismay, and she sent out proclamations all over the land to help her try and shrink her nose somehow, help her escape this awful malady. And so it was, the day after, the second soldier arrived, disguised as a healer. Now the second soldier, using the small bits of cunning and courage that was his share of all they had managed to grow together back in the forest, came up the stairs, stood before the queen in his disguise, his knees knocking together, but his heart still holding on with that courage and his cunning in his mind. He said, oh, my queen, I have heard of such a malady before, and luckily enough I've managed to cure it. So the queen said, well, hurry, please, anything. And so the second soldier handed her a piece of the pear. And if you will remember, the apple caused the malady, and the pear gained relief from it. The apple caused the problem, the pear solved the problem. So with a small piece of the pear, the queen ate, and she felt her nose begin to tingle, and with sheer relief she felt her nose began to shrink. The end of her nose left the coldness of the moat and grew back up towards the castle. It shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until it stopped at the castle gates. And the queen let out a shriek and said, my nose has shrunk a bit, but it's stopped now. How can this be? How can this be? And the healer said, oh, well, you see, unfortunately, in cases like this, noses don't shrink immediately. They grow far faster than they shrink. But I'm sure, my queen, I'm sure if you take another piece of this magic fruit, you'll find that it should help. But this time he handed her a small piece of the apple, and using the cunning that he had, he presented it to her as if it was the same fruit as the pear. So she took a small piece of the apple, and sure enough, her nose grew again. In absolute horror, she felt it not only this time grow down into the moat, but actually grow down through the moat and up the other side. And shivering with the cold of her note, being completely submerged in the moat, the queen cried out, oh, please, help me, it's grown again. So the soldier said, here, my queen, have another piece of the magic fruit. Sure, this will work this time. He handed her a piece of the pear. The queen ate the pear, and her nose shrank back again through the moat, came up through the castle gates, came to the very bottom of the spiral staircase. And the queen, with relief, said, oh, thank the gods. Please, give me more medicine. So using the cunning that he had with him in his heart, that his brothers had helped him find, the second soldier, disguised as a healer, handed her yet another piece of apple, bigger this time. The queen took it hungrily and ate it immediately, and to her horror she felt her nose begin to grow again, and grow even further this time, through the moat and across the meadows and towards the forest. And this went on all day. The soldier would first give her a piece of pear to make her nose shrink, and the queen would feel relief as the nose began to shrink, but then would stop again, and then the soldier gave her a piece of the apple to make her nose grow even longer. Every time he gave her slightly more apple than pear, of course. So every time, even though her nose shrank back a little, her nose grew then longer until her nose had grown. At the end of the day, her nose had grown to an impossible size. Not only had her nose grown all the way towards the forest, not only had it grown through the forest and up the trees, not only were birds nesting in her nose by now, it had grown down through the forest floor where slugs and snails crawled all over it, and it had grown out the other side of the forest and all the way across the land and over the mountains and down through the valleys until at last it had reached the ocean. And not only had that nose then grown through the whole ocean, being nibbled by fish and swam around and tangled in seaweed, it had grown up the other side and grown all the way around the world until with the last piece of apple that she took, her nose had grown all the way around the world to come back through the window behind her of her chamber. And she felt that one thing that all of us hope in all of our lives never to have to feel, that terrible, terrible, terrible feeling of her own nose banging in the back of our head. Now the queen was in absolute dismay, the nose banging in the back of her head constantly as it could grow no further. And the second soldier, still using all of that cunning that he had, said, "Oh, my queen, I've never seen anything like this before. I've healed this problem in the past, but it's always seemed to work. The magic fruit has always worked. I don't know what can be going on. The only thing I can think of, my queen, is that you need a wizard. This is a magical problem." So the queen shouted, "Call for a wizard!" And as luck would have it, a wizard appeared at the door of the castle. Although this wizard, of course, was the third soldier in disguise. He, using the courage and the cunning that the three soldiers had pulled together, came disguised as a wizard with a wizardly hood and a wizardly beard. He entered the room, putting on his best wizardly voice. He said, "Ah, my queen, this would seem to be a magical problem. I will divine for you the solution." He began to burn sacred herbs and incense, and he began to chant, and he began to go into a haze and a trance and to call upon the gods, and he rolled the bones and he dealt out the cards and he consulted the stars, until at last in his best wizardly voice said, "Oh, my queen, I have discovered from the gods and the spirits that no cure can help you in your magical malady of your nose banging into the back of your head after travelling all the way around the world. It's a magical curse that is upon you. No cure can help you until you have lifted the curse. I sense that the curse has been put upon you by your theft of 3 magical items from their rightful owners. Only with the return of these 3 magical items can the cure work upon you and your nose return to normal size." Now the queen didn't like the idea of giving up her 3 treasures, but there's nothing like having your own nose banging in the back of your own head to weaken your resolve. So she called to her maidservant to bring the 3 treasures, the magic cloak, the magic golden pouch and the magic summoning horn, to give them to the wizard, and instructed them to return them to the soldiers in the forest. The wizard bowed and says, "It shall be so, my queen. I feel even now the curse is lifting." And quickly, with the last of his courage and his cunning deserting him, he left the castle, climbing over the nose as he went. And so the second soldier said, "Now, my queen, let's try to heal you properly, as the curse has been lifted." And he gave to the queen an entire pear, a magic pear, to reverse the magic spell of the apples. So the queen hungrily ate the pear, and immediately she felt relief from the back of her head as her nose shrank back through the window, as it started to shrink all the way around the world, all the way back through the ocean, all the way back through the forest, back through the trees, knocking slugs and birds' nests all over the place. And it came back through the moat. And as the second soldier left the castle, climbing down the staircase, he had to hop over the nose as it came past him back up. And as he left the castle and returned to the forest, the queen felt her nose shrink finally back onto her face. And other than a redness and a soreness that seemed to last for a while, her nose was returned to her. And back in the forest, the 3 soldiers rejoiced for the return of their treasures and for the victory they had had with the cunning and the courage that they had summoned. And they vowed forever to support each other and to raise cunning and courage amongst themselves for the rest of their lives whenever they would need it. And so they returned to their castle. They summoned back their fairy host, and they brought all of their fine things they had before, and they lived as happily as anyone can ever live together till the end of their lives. Now that would be the end of the story, if not for one thing. Sometime later, deep in the woods, the little old man, gnarled as an old oak tree in his long red cloak, sat around the fire. And as he sat around the fire, someone came out of the darkness to join him. And he saw the magical queen come and sit on the other side of the fire and regard him with her steely eyes. And the two looked at each other, unmoving and unspeaking for the longest of times, until at last the little old man leaned forward and said, "Well, I think that worked rather well, don't you? Those 3 soldiers have managed to summon enough cunning and enough courage to last them now for the rest of their lives." And the queen sighed, sounding slightly resentful, said, "Well, no, you're right, they needed that. But next time you be the bad guy, because my nose still hurts." And that's the end. Thank you.